house on Mulberry Hill had always been the subject of whispers and hushed conversations among the townsfolk. Its dilapidated structure, broken windows, and overgrown garden made it a perfect backdrop for the horror stories that swirled around it. They said it was haunted, that it had been the site of unspeakable tragedies. I never believed any of it, until I had to spend a night there. It all started when my friend Josh dared me to prove the ghost stories wrong. We were sitting in his dimly lit basement, the kind of place where we often gathered to tell each other scary stories and boast about our bravery. Josh, ever the skeptic, smirked as he tossed me the old rusty key to the house on Mulberry Hill. "You're not scared, are you?" he taunted. I wasn't about to back down. I took the key and, with a mixture of bravado and apprehension, promised to spend the night there. It was supposed to be a simple test of courage, a way to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. But as I stood before the house that night, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was cold and still, and the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the ground. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of decay hit me like a wall. I hesitated on the threshold, listening to the silence that seemed to press in on all sides. Then, summoning my courage, I stepped inside. The interior was worse than I had imagined. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like tattered curtains. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step echoing through the empty rooms. I explored cautiously, trying to familiarize myself with the layout. There was a grand staircase leading to the upper floor, several empty rooms, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, like eyes boring into my back. I turned around quickly several times, but there was never anyone there, just shadows and the creaking of the old house. I decided to set up camp in the living room. I had brought a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and some snacks to get me through the night. As I unrolled my sleeping bag, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was a soft, almost imperceptible thumping sound. I froze, listening intently. It stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Determined to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of, I grabbed my flashlight and headed up the staircase. The steps groaned louder with each step, and I half expected them to collapse beneath me. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors. I opened the first door on my left and found a small bedroom, empty except for an old rocking chair that sat in the corner. The room was freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I quickly shut the door and moved to the next room. Each room was much the same, empty, cold, and filled with an oppressive silence. I was about to head back downstairs when I noticed a door at the end of the hallway that I hadn't opened yet. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to walk towards it. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a blast of icy air hit me. Inside was a large bedroom, furnished with a four-poster bed covered in a thick layer of dust. There was a wardrobe against one wall and a dressing table with a cracked mirror on the other. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was dressed in a long, tattered gown, her hair hanging in matted strands over her face. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move or speak. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Suddenly, the figure moved. It took a step towards me, and I could see her face, pale with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The house seemed to come alive around me, the walls closing in as I fled down the stairs and back into the living room. I grabbed my sleeping bag and flashlight, not caring that my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them. I rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was trapping me inside. Panic set in as I yanked on the doorknob with all my might. Finally, with a loud creak, the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the hill. I looked back only once, and in the moonlight, I could see the woman standing in the doorway, watching me with those hollow eyes. I ran all the way home, not stopping until I was safely inside my own house, the door locked and bolted behind me. I never spoke about that night to anyone, not even Josh, but the memory of that woman haunted my dreams, her hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. I knew I could never go back to that house, but a part of me felt drawn to it, compelled to uncover the secrets that lay within. Months passed, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The woman's hollow eyes haunted my dreams, and I found myself obsessively researching the history of the house on Mulberry Hill. I discovered that it had once belonged to the Whitaker family, who had mysteriously vanished one stormy night over a century ago. The townsfolk whispered that Mrs. Whitaker had gone mad and murdered her family before taking her own life. Despite my fear, I felt a growing need to return to the house. I needed answers, and the only place I could find them was within those decaying walls. This time, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I drove to the house early in the morning, hoping that the daylight would dispel some of my terror. The house looked just as it had that night, standing ominously at the top of the hill. I took a deep breath and walked up the overgrown path, my heart hammering in my chest. The front door creaked open as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the musty smell of decay filling my nostrils. I made my way to the living room and took a deep breath. I knew that I needed to go back to the room where I had seen the woman. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The hallway seemed longer this time, the shadows darker. I reached the door at the end and hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The room was just as I remembered it, cold and filled with a palpable sense of dread. The woman was not there, but her presence lingered in the air. I walked over to the wardrobe and opened it, half expecting her to be hiding inside. But it was empty, save for a few tattered dresses hanging from rusty hangers. I turned to the dressing table, my eyes drawn to the cracked mirror. There was something behind it, a small, hidden compartment. My fingers fumbled as I pried it open, revealing a bundle of old letters. They were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The letters were written by Mrs. Whitaker, and as I read them, a chilling story unfolded. She had been tormented by visions of her dead husband and children, who she believed were haunting her. Her letters grew increasingly frantic, filled with descriptions of ghostly apparitions and strange noises in the night. In the last letter, she wrote that she could no longer bear the torment and planned to end her life. As I read the final words, a cold breeze swept through the room and the door slammed shut. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw her standing in the doorway. Her eyes were no longer hollow, but filled with a deep, unending sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I took a step back, my mind racing. The stories were true. Mrs. Whitaker's spirit was trapped in this house, tormented by the ghosts of her past. I knew that I had to help her find peace, but I didn't know how. My eyes fell on the letters in my hand, and I realized that they held the key. I gathered the letters and hurried down the stairs, the woman's presence following me. In the living room, I found an old fireplace and, with trembling hands, lit a fire. I placed the letters in the flames, watching as they were consumed by the fire. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. "Thank you," Mrs. Whitaker's voice whispered, and then she was gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. I knew that her spirit had finally found peace, released from the torment that had held her captive for so long. I walked out of the house, the morning sun shining brightly, and felt a sense of closure. The house on Mulberry Hill would always be a place of tragedy, but now it was also a place of redemption. As I drove away, I knew that I had put the past to rest, and the ghostly woman would no longer haunt my dreams.